Welcome everyone. Welcome to the webinar on the FSC Chain of Custody new standard version. Before we begin, I would like to introduce myself and my colleagues. So my name is Anika Malik. I am an auditor at Preferred by Nature and I'm based in Kempten in Germany. I've audited to the FSC standards for over 12 years now, and I'm here with two of my colleagues, Tim Roland and Evelie Pind, and they will introduce themselves as well. Tim.
Okay, I'll start off. That's good. So my name is Tim Roelands, FSC auditor in Belgium and the Netherlands for Preferred by Nature. Already 6 years or so auditing for Preferred by Nature. Yeah, and happy to be here and help out with the webinar.
Yes, thanks, Tim. My name is Evelie Pind and I'm working as system specialist in supply chains. I have been working in Preferred by Nature for almost 5 years now. I started as COC auditor, but now focusing more on supporting auditors. And I'm based in Estonian office. So thanks.
Thank you. So this webinar covers the new FSC Chain of Custody standard version with the introduction of the FSC Core Labour Requirements. The reason we are here today is FSC has introduced these new requirements for certificate holders, and we hope this presentation can provide you as certificate holders with a good overview of what is coming and explain the new requirements. Just some housekeeping notes before we begin. The webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the Preferred by Nature website by the end of the year. As participants, everyone is muted. However, if you have questions, please feel free to write them into the chat box. Evelie is monitoring the chat box and will write answers as they come in. And then we have 3 question and answer sessions within the webinar to answer any questions. And of course, if we run out of time or don't have the answers right now, we will still address them. We plan to make a question and answer document at the end and make that available as well. And our webinar today should run an hour and a half. So the agenda, again, the webinar will be focusing on the FSC Core Labour Requirements. We cover who the requirements apply to and how certificate holders can meet these requirements, in other words, through a policy statement and through completing a self-assessment. So let's begin. The main FSC Chain of Custody standard is FSC STD 40004. It has been updated and is now version 3-1 instead of version 3-0. The major change is the addition of the FSC Core Labour Requirements. However, the standard also now incorporates advice notes and official interpretations of standard requirements that were previously released by FSC. Some of these updates include what is written on the slide here. I will read them out. Requirement 1.1. The organization shall support fiber testing conducted by its certification body and ASI by surrendering samples and specimens of materials and products and information about species composition for verification upon request. This was previously written as Advice 40004-14. The standard also now has a new annex, Annex C, which includes examples of components of a product that need to be certified. And again, this was previously released by FSC in Advice 40004-06. Finally, there are some minor changes within requirements for compliance with timber legality legislation, product groups, percentage system, and credit system. For the new core labor requirements, these are found within the standard in requirements 1.5 to 1.6, 1.10 to 1.11, the entire section 7, and Annex D. A side note, the new requirements are found within the standard from section 7 onwards. So this means that there are some numbering changes from section 7 on in the standard. As a certificate holder, this may affect how your procedures are written and numbered if they're following the standard numbering. This slide is about the transition period to the standard. The transition period was originally started with the publication of the FSC standard version in February 2021, but later the effective date was postponed and the transition period was extended. The current dates are on this slide. The effective date of the standard is September 1st, 2021. This is the date at which the new standard version can be used. The transition period is this date, 1st September 2021 until 31st December 2022. During this time, both versions of the standard may be used, so both the current 3.0 version and this new version 3.1. However, the date by which all certificate holders must have had an evaluation to version 3-1 is 31st December 2022. Finally, the date by which all certificate holders must have an active certificate to version 3-1 is 6 months following the end of the transition period, which is June 30th, 2023. The additional 6 months after the transition period is there to allow time for audit reports to be reviewed, major nonconformances to be closed, and certificates to be issued. So both FSC and Preferred by Nature have prepared some resources to help certificate holders. All of these resources are available on the Preferred by Nature homepage under the section Changes Announced by FSC 2021. Of course, the FSC resources are also on the FSC webpage. The first resource is the standard itself. There is also a track changes version and a version comparison document available, so you can literally see every word that was changed in this new version. There are also 3 webinars produced by FSC. There is an introductory webinar on the core labor requirements, which is about 15 minutes long, a technical webinar of about 45 minutes, and an hour-long webinar on how to complete a self-assessment. There is also a FSC question and answer document, an implementation guide, and about 18 national self-assessment templates. Finally, Preferred by Nature has developed sample procedures for certificate holders, and again, they're available on our website. So now we move on to the specific details about how certificate holders can demonstrate implementation of the new requirements. The 3 new elements are the FSC Core Labour Requirements, the policy statement, and the self-assessment. Tim will present the first section on FSC Core Labour Requirements, and then I will continue on with the next 2 parts.
Okay, thank you for that, Anika. So yeah, let's take a look at the first bit of cheese here on the diagram, the core labor requirements divided into 4 fundamental rights. The effective abolition of child labor, elimination of all forms of forced and compulsory labor, the elimination of discrimination in respect to employment and occupation, and freedom of association and effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining. All these rights and the requirements related to those are found in the new Chapter 7 of the standard, and each of these 4 rights has a series of requirements attached to them in that chapter. Yeah, please go to the next one. Here we can see what's new in the standard. So section 7, the new chapter, is about the description of the fundamental rights of the core FSC core labor requirements. Then we have clause 1.5, which is about adopting and implementing policies that include, of course, and encompass the labor requirements, where you describe how you will fulfill them and how you will monitor it. Then we have clause 1.6 and the annex, which is about the self-assessment that you have to make as an organization in order to do sort kind of self-assessment and describe how you will apply the core labor requirements. And then we have clause 1.11, which allows organizations to demonstrate compliance through some other social certifications. Now, it could be that you are certified for another social certificate that already audits and covers most of the FSC Core Labour Requirements. Then it could be accepted by FSC for general compliance with the FSC Core Labour Requirements. As of the moment, I don't think any scheme has yet been recognized by the FSC. But progress on this will be, I think, continuous as organizations can also submit certification schemes for that. And FSC will be answering those and then publishing in case any of those would be recognized. Okay, can we go to the next slide? So let's take a look at what the interaction, let's say, between FSC and national laws. It could be that you are, of course, expected as a certificate holder to comply with the national laws. It could be that national laws are not completely covering FSC Core Labour Requirements. So it could be that you have to do some extra verifications against core labor requirements that are not covered by your national law. It could be that there are gaps in between national law and the labor requirements, or it could be that there are even contradictions. Now, in the old standard required certificate holders to be in compliance with national law. The new standard also requires certificate holders to be in compliance with the core labor requirements. So at any time you have to identify the legal obligations and how they can affect your ability to comply with the core labor requirements. In case there should be or there is a gap or a contradiction in between the two, then you would have to, it could lead to a gray zone where you can't either comply with one or the other, or you have to find some kind of in-between solution. Then you have to describe this in your self-assessment and give appropriate explanations for how you would go about covering both requirements, both national and the core labor requirements. So this could lead to a bit of friction, but as we haven't had a lot of practical cases yet, I don't know in how far this would cause problems. Okay, sorry, next slide. So what do you have to do as a company in order to prepare for the new standard and get ready for it? You first of course you have to develop your policy statements, including the core labor requirements. Then you have to implement them, send it to stakeholders, and make sure that it is robust and functioning. And then you have to complete the self-assessment and submit it to the certification body. Once you submit it to the certification body, the auditor will verify policy statements if they have been adopted and implemented. We will also verify if the policy statements have been made available to stakeholders, and then we will look at the self-assessment itself, see if it's completed correct, and then we can also use it during or as a guidance for on-site audits, for example, to see if we need to interview people, how many things we have to look at, if there are high risks in some areas, and how you have been able to cover them. So that is the first step, of course, into implementing the new standard. So who does it apply to? Which certificate holders have to make this or have to do this? Of course, all companies that are certified to the 40004 Chain of Custody standard. For single certificates, the FSC Core requirements apply to any operation and all sites included in a single certificate, of course. Multi-site certificates and group certificates also have to cover all their group members or site members, and the the central office in this case is responsible for for the conformity against the labor requirements. In this case, there's another slide on multi-sites later on, but the central office can make either one central risk self-assessment or one for each site. If you make one central self-assessment, then you of course have to include all the sites and all the legislations, because for the different countries your sites are situated in. Non-FSC certified contractors are also included. We will talk about that later in a few slides, and see how and why they are included and how you can cover that. But they are also falling under the core labor requirements. Next slide, please. So any certificate holder that applies this chain of custody standard 40004 and everything that is covered by the scope of the certificate will have to cover all those requirements also by the core labor requirements, because they are in the 40004 standard. So that makes sense. At the certificate holder level, you do not have to, of course, work upstream or downstream. You can, if you buy from a certified company, FSC certified material, then of course that company, your supplier, will have the 40004 standard also in place, and they will cover the core labor requirements for themselves. And also, if you sell it to clients that are certified, they will cover the core labor requirements on their side. So you only have to look at your own scope of the certificate and all sites and activities included in the scope. In terms of personnel that you have to include or that have to comply with the core labor requirements, it is also all personnel that is under the scope of the certificate. So all employees, seasonal, temporary workers, immigrant workers, subcontractors, they are all included. Of course, if you have if you're a trader office and you only have 3 workers, you will have probably a different looking self-assessment than if you are complex or a big pulp mill or so with a lot of seasonal workers and subcontractors. FSC also included the definition of workers in the new standard, which is can be seen here below. So it includes all employed persons, self-employed persons, part-time and seasonal workers, self-employed contractors, subcontractors, and all of that following the ILO convention definition. Okay, what about production lines or activities within a company that don't fall under the FSC certificate? If there is a clear distinction, a production line does not have to fall under the scope of the certificate, and also, of course, not under the scope of the core labor requirements. So if, let's say, you are a company that makes either or both wooden furniture that is under the scope of the certificate, and then you also make some wooden toys that don't fall under the FSC certificate, then of course the production line and the workers on the line for the wooden toys, they don't have to be, or they don't have to comply with the labor requirements. All the personnel that is in the that falls under the scope and works for the other production line will have to be compliant with the core labor requirements. Of course, okay, go back. Yeah, it's of course you have to still make sure or remember that you signed FSC policy of association, which also states that you won't be applying any child labor and all the other requirements in the core labor requirements. So you still have to comply with those in the other part of the organization that's not included in the certificate. Okay, next slide. If you have any controlled wood or reclaimed material suppliers, either certified under 40005 or uncertified, those suppliers are also excluded from the core labor requirements because they do not apply to the chain of custody 40004 standard. So if you have suppliers like that, you don't have to include them in the FSC Core Labour Requirements. It's strictly for activities under the 40004 standards. Okay, next. Now we're back to subcontractors. We already said a bit that they have to be included as long as a subcontractor is, of course, under the scope of the organization's chain of custody certificate. This basically means that if you have, or if it is an activity that falls under the requirement of an outsourcing agreement, or if you already have an outsourcing agreement in place, those subcontractors will also fall under the certificate holder's responsibility to be included or to cover the FSC Core Labour Requirements. Of course, if it's a subcontractor that does anything not related to the scope of the FSC certificate, then they do not have to be included. So why are they included, or how are they included? Of course, because they fall under the scope of the FSC and are evaluated by the certification body. There are some clauses in, or some requirements in the standard already covering the subcontractors as part of the chain of custody standard. And we have 13.2, which states which activities are included. So if you have any purchase, processing, storage, labeling, or invoicing of product done by another company, a third-party company, those are activities that are subject to the certification what's it called? Outsourcing agreement, sorry. And then in 13.4, it says if you should establish an outsourcing agreement, and they have to be conformed to all the certification requirements related to this activity. So this also means they have to comply with what is in the 40004 standard. And of course, the FSC Core Labour Requirements are in there, so they have to comply with them. Otherwise, or you could say the reasoning behind it is if you don't want to do core labor requirements, you could outsource all your production and don't have to worry about it anymore, which is of course not the intention of the whole core labor requirements changes of the standards. Yeah, next one, please. So what do you do when you have subcontractors and you also have to include them, or you have to make sure that they comply with the FSC Core Labour Requirements? Of course, you have to start with the outsourcing agreement. Probably it's already in place from the previous standard where it was also required. In the case of countries where the risk for all 4 core labor requirements is low, you could demonstrate it, or the subcontractor could demonstrate it by signing an outsourcing agreement where the core labor requirements have been included, and where they sign that they agree to it and will follow up on all the specifications. Now, of course, if you have a country with higher risk, or if the certification body or any stakeholders have any evidence or any situation where they have the situation is higher risk than for infraction of any of the core labor requirements, then of course you have to do something else. You cannot just sign a document saying, yeah, well, it will be okay, and that's it. So you will have to provide some additional evidence, maybe some training, maybe some audits with the subcontractor, provide them some procedures on what they have to do. There are many options. Whatever you do, if you are using subcontractors, you of course have to include them in your self-assessment and explain there what kind of actions you have undertaken to make sure that the subcontractor is in compliance with all the core labor requirements. Okay, can we go to the next one? So let's say you're a trader, a broker, just one person or two persons working in an office. Why do we need to, or do we need to apply all these core labor requirements to our certificate or to our organization? And the answer is yes, you have to do that, because of course you're again certified against 40004 Chain of Custody Standards, so you have to comply with all the requirements in there. It's of course clear that if you only have very few staff, that your self-assessment will probably have some requirements that are not applicable, or you can explain why some of the sections do not apply. You will have a bit of an easier time filling out a self-assessment and complying with all the requirements, but still you have to do it, and you have to present it during the audit, and it will be looked at the same as any other FSC certified company. Okay, let's get back to multi-site. So we already said our multi-site or group certificates are in the same boat. You can either complete one self-assessment for the whole organization, but then take care of all legal requirements for each country the sites are located in, or you can do one self-assessment for each site or each group member. The central office or the group manager are responsible for this. Also, there is a requirement that all group members have to sign a declaration saying that they meet the FSC Core Labour Requirements. So they already had to sign a declaration if it's in group certificates, so that can be included there. Of course, if you have now an audit in the transition period, which runs from September this year to the end of December, and you have not prepared all your sites with a self-assessment, you have to make sure that the sites that are being sampled in the next audits during the transition period, that those sites have a completed self-assessment available for the certification body. And then after the transition period audit, and by the time it's by the end of next year, all sites have to have a self-assessment in place. So you still have some time. If you have like an audit in a few months already, you still have some time to complete the self-assessment for all the other sites. Okay.
There is no question, so you can move on.
No questions at the moment? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, maybe I'll pause for just 30 seconds in case someone's absorbed the information. It's a good chance. Okay, then otherwise we move on to the next section of the standard, which is on policy statements. That's found in requirement 1.5 of the standard, and that is what is written here. So FSC requires organizations to have and implement one or more policy statements that encompass the FSC Core Labour Requirements. And the policy statements shall be made available to stakeholders and to the organization's certificate body. Sometimes organizations already have statements or implemented policies that cover the principles and practices outlined in the FSC Core Labour Requirements, and these may be used to demonstrate conformity, just remembering that they have to still encompass all the core labour requirements. So how to demonstrate conformity? You can develop a policy, or as just said, update or use an existing policy or policies. It is necessary for management and staff to be aware of the policies, meaning it's not enough to have the document. Staff and management must also be familiar with it. You have to update pre-existing operations, procedures, and systems. The policy must be monitored and enforced as needed. And finally, we wanted to clarify that the signed self-declaration as part of the trademark license agreement with FSC is not considered the certificate holder policy statement. The second part of requirement 1.5 is that the policy or policies are made available to stakeholders. How this is done is flexible. It can be made available via website, newsletter, posted in the workplace, handouts, employee manuals or code of conducts, sent as requested to stakeholders. It's completely up to the organization. The options noted in the slide are options FSC has provided, but it's not a complete list. And here is an example of what a policy statement looks like. This is a policy statement for not using child labor. The company will not tolerate the use of child or forced labor nor exploitation of children in any of its global operations and facilities. So you have another little pause for questions. Emily, did anything come in? Or
No questions.
Please do mute yourself. Okay, so then I move on. The last element is to complete a self-assessment. The point of the self-assessment is to see if you're meeting the core labor requirements. The core labor requirements are based on the International Labour Organization conventions. Most countries have placed these into legislation and national law. This means if you're a certificate holder in one of these countries, you may find that you already operate under the FSC Core Labour Requirements. So these are the core labor requirements once again. They are International Labour Organization generic criteria and indicators that were presented in the 2017 FSC report called FSC Report on Generic Criteria and Indicators based on ILO Core Convention Principles. They cover the fundamental principles and rights of work, which are freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining, the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, the effective abolition of child labor, and the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. This slide shows the umbrella clauses. There are a few sub-clauses in the standard, and we will go through them in the following slides as well. Clauses 7.2 to 7.3 here are the FSC Core Labour Requirements covering the principles and rights at work. Clause 7.1, however, is about applying these core labor requirements and states that the organization shall give due consideration to the national law. Due consideration means the certificate holder must demonstrate that they are meeting the requirements while also demonstrating that they have analyzed and considered the relevance of the national laws. So it's not necessary as a certificate holder to list the laws, but they can be used as a mechanism to demonstrate conformity. Additionally, some core labor requirements go beyond legal requirement, and the self-assessment is that require companies to how they meet the requirements and whether the legal cover them. Okay. The self-assessment guides the process where the certificate holder demonstrates their evidence of. I think I'll stop here. Is there a way to mute all the participants because we're getting a bit of interference? Okay, maybe not. So apologies for that. But I go on. Okay, so the FSC in Annex in the Annex has provided the self-assessment and requires you to respond to prompting questions. So you can see an excerpt of that over here. And in completing the self-assessment, FSC asks to describe your country situation or legal framework, meaning are there laws or legal obligations in your country that apply to the requirement? It also asks to describe your organizational situation, meaning how and why your organization conforms or does not conform with the requirements. And finally, to list the evidence you will rely on to demonstrate conformity. Again, the self-assessment template, apologies, that was wrong. Technical issues, there we go. Okay, the self-assessment template is found in Appendix D of the Chain of Custody Standard. Additionally, there is a fillable self-assessment available from FSC as well as national self-assessment templates. The certificate holder is required to complete the self-assessment annually and as well when there are changes to the certificate scope. And the certificate holder is required to submit the self-assessment to the certificate body before the audit. Annex D of FSC 40004 V3-1 describes how to complete the self-assessment. The instructions are listed here. It's to identify relevant documents and other material that the auditor can review to verify the reference statements on the self-assessment. It's to respond to the questions in the self-assessment as completely and truthfully as possible, as knowingly making false statements on the self-assessment may result in suspension or termination of the certificate. As Tim mentioned, organizations shall also identify any legal obligations that may affect the ability to comply with the core labor requirements. And even in the case of legal impairments, organizations must demonstrate compliance with the FSC core labor requirements. For multi-site and group chain of custody certificate holders, the central office is responsible for completing the self-assessment for all participating sites under the scope of the certificate. Now I will present a short guide on how to develop the self-assessments. FSC provides guiding questions to all 4 categories of the core labor requirement in Annex D. Some examples are shown on this slide for child labor. For the organization, do you have a policy on child labor? What is the statutory, legal, or regulated minimum age at the place of your operations? What measures have you taken to ensure child labor is not used in your operations? There are different documents you can use as evidence of your answer. In the next slide, we go through each core labor requirement clause that must be responded to within the self-assessment, and then examples of the documents that can be provided as evidence of meeting the requirements. Starting with clause 7.2, this clause indicates that the organization shall demonstrate that they do not use child labor. Clause 7.2.1 to 7.2.3 describes the age requirement, including the exception that those between the ages of 13 to 15 may participate in light work, and the restriction that any hazardous or heavy work must be completed by those 18 or older. The standard also prohibits the worst forms of child labor. You can find the definitions of all these terms for light work, for the worst forms of child labor, and other terms. There are in Annex E of the standard. And here is a list of examples of documents or records that you can use to show you're meeting these requirements on child labor. They are a policy on child labor, work contracts or agreements, including with recruitment agencies, an employment policy or hiring procedures, age and identification verification procedures, employee records, including those of seasonal and migrant workers, identity documents such as copies of birth certificates, national ID cards, or school or university certificates, and a risk assessment on child labor. The next FSC core labor requirement is on forced labor. Clause 7.3 indicates that the organization must eliminate all forms of forced or compulsory labor. The subpoints indicate that the organization must demonstrate that the regulations are voluntary and that there are no practices indicative of forced or compulsory labor as listed under Clause 7.3.2. Examples of records that can be used in the self-assessment are on the slide. I will just read a few of them, but examples are application forms, pay records, employment contracts, national or industry pay standards, any dispute or grievance procedures that an organization could have, and associate records, work agreements, records of licensed recruitment agencies, records of labor departments or inspectorate. The third core labor is clause 7.4, and it requires that organizations ensure there is no discrimination in employment and occupation. As I said earlier, the standard does provide definitions, and related to this clause, the standard gives the definition of discrimination that certificate holders must use when explaining their conformance to this requirement. And again, Annex D includes prompting questions to assist certificate holders in preparing their explanations and evidence of conformity. And here is the list of example documents or records that can be used in the self-assessment. For example, pay records, records of labor inspectorate or departments, job advertisements, job application forms and records, any equal opportunity policies that could be present, grievances or complaints procedures and records, job evaluation or performance assessments, positive discrimination or affirmative action programs, employment demographics such as gender ratio in job types, discriminatory reports, social responsibility reports, work contracts, and performance assessments. The last one is 7.5, which requires that certificate holders respect the freedom of association and the effective right to collective bargaining. The organization does not need to demonstrate there is a worker organization present, only that workers may choose to join or form a union or create a workers' representative group or committee. The workers would not be under any obligation to do so. And here is the list of example documents or records that can be used in the self-assessment. We have, again, the policies of the organization, complaints register, collective bargaining agreement, minutes or documents from meetings related to the development of collective bargaining agreements, minutes of workers' committee meetings, Ministry of Labor reports, court reports, documented evidence and records of the workers' representatives' elections. And to complete the webinar, here is a list of upcoming resources. So FSC International will provide a list of compatible social certification schemes. As Tim mentioned, they don't have these developed as of today's date, but they are planned to publish a list by the end of this calendar year. FSC network partners are also finalizing some country or region-specific self-assessment templates, and numerous national adaptations of the Core Labour Requirements Self-Assessment Form have been published on the FSC website. You can find them as in a zip file format, and they're available for the countries on this slide here. So they're available for Australia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Chile, Croatia, Denmark, Germany, Italy, Japan, Indonesia, New Zealand, Portugal, Serbia, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, Switzerland, UK, and US. And the last point is that FSC is seeking positive impact stories related to the core labor requirements following its implementation. That's it. Do we have any questions? Otherwise, thank you very much for listening.